Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to you all this afternoon on a Sunday afternoon, and a warm one, so I'm surprised to see so many people here. It's gratifying, and welcome to those of you who are zooming in from elsewhere as well. My name is Thomas Berman, and I'm the director of the Medieval Institute. And one of the events we do annually is we ask our graduate students to collectively decide on a speaker that they want to bring to campus. And they not only decide on the speaker, they do all of the logistical work to get that speaker here, learning some essential academic skills in doing so, since arranging speakers turns out to be a thing that one does a fair amount of in this life. So that's what tonight's event is, and I'm very pleased that our students have chosen a remarkable scholar to join us tonight and to speak. And to introduce him, I want to bring one of our esteemed graduate students up here who will do that, Ben Piccari.
I just wanted to echo Dr. Berman's welcome to all of you, as well as our esteemed guests. I hope you will all enjoy what Dr. Refini has in store for us. We chose him together as a group of Medieval Institute graduate students because of his excellent work on the intersections of music and literature. He is also published widely and spoken widely on reception history and translation history. He's most recently the winner of the National Endowment for the Humanities Rome Prize, where he's working on his next monograph, which we're excited about. But today we'll be hearing about his most recent published monograph 2 years ago, the Vernacular Aristotle, not Aristotle, I'm sorry. Yes, Aristotle. My brain, I'm like, oh no, did I say the wrong person? The Vernacular Aristotle. And we are so glad to have you, Dr. Refini. So please, could you join me in giving our guest the warmest welcome?
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Dr. Berman, for introducing this session. I'm really delighted to be here, and I will just start right away. So I hope you won't mind if I begin with a sort of somewhat personal preamble, very short, since Ben was kind enough to mention my Aristotle book. Well, the book came out in early March 2020, which, it's a period which we all have in our mind, because we kind of, these are the first 6 copies which I got from Cambridge University Press, and I opened the box, and 3 days after that, we were all sort of stuck home. So that year, of course, there was no Renaissance Society of America meeting. I was hoping, to have my book at the book exhibit there. That didn't happen. I had other book launches sort of planned for the fall, and those were also sort of put off. And I did have a chance to talk about it on Zoom on a couple of occasions, which was really nice, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. But this is the very first time I'm talking about it in person, and it makes it very special. So I would like to thank the grad students for inviting me to give this talk here at Notre Dame, at the Medieval Institute, and I'm truly delighted to be here and also honored to be part of this prestigious series of lectures. So when Eleonora, Eileen, and Ben reached out to invite me, they said they would like to hear about my research on the vernacular reception of Aristotle, and more broadly about my work on vernacular translation in the Middle Ages. And while my research lately has been moving into slightly different territories, I thought this would be the ideal setting for sort of revisiting a topic which remains, of course, one of my main research interests. So what I would like to do today is to offer an overview of my book, focusing in particular on questions of iconography, audience, and translation, before turning to one case study that will allow me to address, if not answer, the question embedded in my title, who's Aristotle? So whose Aristotle are we talking about? A question which can be rephrased in many different ways. To whom did Aristotle belong in the period between the age of Dante and the advent of print? Who did read Aristotle, why and how? What Aristotle did they read? And also, what was the role of readers within the reception process? In other words, To what extent were Aristotle's readers participating in the active process of receiving, responding, and also rewriting? And finally, how did reception and translation intersect? That is, how did reception and translation contribute to the appropriation of the legacy of Aristotle on the part of audiences beyond the boundaries of Latinate knowledge? And in order to tackle these questions, let me begin rather playfully with a novella. More precisely, a very short tale from the 13th century anonymous collection of novelle known as Il Novellino, which is undoubtedly the most significant collection of novelle, at least within the Italian tradition, before Boccaccio's Decameron. The protagonist of Novellino 78 is a philosopher, and I quote, who was much given to vulgarizing science to please some lords and other persons, end of quote. And please bear in mind this particular identification of the philosopher's patrons, lords and other persons, for I will go back to it shortly. So one night, in a vision, the philosopher translator sees the goddesses of science in the form of beautiful women in a brothel. Asked by the philosopher why they are there, they blame him for that. You are the one who brought us here. Once awake, the philosopher decides to give up vulgarizing science, and he realizes that, and this is the final quote of the page, not all things are adapted to all persons. Unsurprisingly, this novella has been commented upon by scholars who have been writing on vernacular translation in medieval Italy, and I wish to mention here the insightful reading by my colleague Alison Cornish in her monograph on vernacular translation in Dante's Italy, because that's really a remarkable, very fine reading of this particular novella. Today, I start from here because, to my mind, this novella highlights three issues which have been very important within my own work and still are on the vernacular reception of Aristotle in Italy between the age of Dante and the dawn of humanism. So, in a way, my work kind of began by picking up where Alison Cornish ended, and I sort of followed the legacy of vernacular translation and its dynamics through the Quattrocento, through the 15th century. And incidentally, I wish to stress that my chronological frame in this research was a little bit of a hybrid, because I've been working on two centuries, the 14th century and the 15th century, which normally tend to be addressed separately. And I hope to demonstrate that when it comes to studying the dynamics of translation across Latinate and vernacular knowledge, these two centuries, in spite of significant innovations and changes, which are definitely there, can also be read and should be probably read as a continuum. So let me go back to the three issues at stake in the novella. First, this tale presents translation as a problem. Specifically, translation as a problem within a context in which the status of the vernacular is not, or not yet, commensurate with that of Latin. The philosopher in the novella is obviously a learned individual, someone who is conversant with Latin, someone who has undoubtedly studied either in a religious school or at a university, someone who is definitely able to translate from Latin into the vernacular, but feels the pressure of an academic context, an elitist academic context, that looked down on vernacular translation due to long-lasting biases. And one of these biases is the one expressed at the end of the novella. Not all things are adapted to all persons. Second, the novella raises the question, at the behest of whom is the translator translating? He does it, and here I go back to the patrons, to please some lords and other persons. While the definition of this targeted audience is short and not very informative, it does evoke a situation in which there is a lay audience of wealthy patrons eager to read sources of academic knowledge, but in order to do it, this audience needs those sources to be translated into the vernacular. Ultimately, this kind of readers, even when they received some sort of basic training in Latin, found it easier and more pleasant to read in their own language. And this is, by the way, the same kind of vernacular audience that Dante has in mind when he writes the Convivio, his main philosophical work on which I shall return. The third point raised by the novella is the fact that the problem of translation is presented as intrinsically connected with an idea of the vernacular that is not only gendered, the vernacular is after all the mother tongue, but also, and most important within the economy of this particular novella, pejorative because of its being gendered. When the goddesses of science are made vernacular, they become prostitutes, appealing and seductive, yet dangerous and misleading. Now, these three issues, translation, audience readership, and the gendered framing of the vernacular, are at the core of my research, which considers them within a broader reflection on the mechanisms of reception, and more specifically, on the ways in which translation and reception intersect at a particular cultural and historical juncture, in which the priority of Latin as a language of knowledge begins to be challenged by current developments in vernacular culture. In this respect, of course, the case of Aristotle is particularly fruitful to examine, for within the time period which I addressed in my work, Aristotle, the philosopher with capital P, was everywhere, and he was indeed translated in many different ways. I think there's no other figure so present everywhere as Aristotle was between the 13th century and Humanism, and actually even beyond that. And so the case of Aristotle allows to make some, I think, generalizations which can be useful more broadly to discussions of translation and reception in medieval and early Renaissance Italy. Now, Aristotle's pervasive presence in the culture of the time is effectively illustrated by his iconography, which mirrors the changing status of the philosopher's auctoritas, and which I read as an implied discourse on the ethics and politics of language in the period, particularly the ethical sort of choice of using the vernacular even for dealing with something like philosophy or science, which had been dealt with previously primarily, if not exclusively, within the Latinate context. Emblematic of these tensions, which are both ethical and political, but also linguistic, are the competing iconographies of Aristotle that, in a way, summarize the process through which the stern philosopher of the scholastic tradition was domesticated and made conversant with the vernacular world. On the one hand, the Mounted Aristotle, which refers to an apocryphal anecdote very popular throughout the Middle Ages, and also in the Renaissance. Aristotle, basically, according to this narrative, is sort of reprimanding his pupil Alexander the Great for his excessive interest in matters of love, and in women in particular. But of course, Aristotle himself is turned into a victim of love. He's seduced by the courtesan Phyllis, and he ends up being mounted and whipped by her under the gaze of Alexander himself. So the taming of the philosopher is, of course, a satire. But I read it also as a reflection on the conflict between learning and nature, with repercussions on matters of language. And within this context, of course, Latin stands on the side of learning and the vernacular stands on the side of nature. I know that the word nature is a very problematic one, but the reason why, after thinking a lot about it, I've been using this term is because it actually comes up as a key term in one of the most important versions of the story, which is the Le d'Aristote, a 13th century French poem which narrates in full detail the story of Aristotle and the courtesan. And in that particular retelling of the story, the term nature really comes up as sort of the element which challenges the stern attitude of Aristotle. This particular image, which you can see on the screen, is, by the way, a beautiful rendition of the scene from a cycle of secular frescoes in the Palazzo Comunale at San Gimignano near Siena, and this is from the very early 14th century. But the other iconography, sort of competing with that of the Mounted Aristotle, is that of Aristotle enthroned. The official, if you will, Aristotelian iconography. And Aristotle here is the authoritative guarantor of all forms of knowledge. Yet, even here, the representation of the philosopher is not only about philosophical and scientific knowledge, but also about the ethics of language. The philosopher par excellence, the core of the university curriculum, speaks, of course, Latin. And this Latin is the same Latin which was the regular currency of academic learning. The same Latin into which the works of Aristotle had been translated in the Middle Ages. The kind of Latin that shaped the corpus which we still know as Aristoteles Latinus. This particular Aristotle, which you see on the screen, was painted by Taddeo di Bartolo. Again, we are in the context of the Siena region. This is really from the Palazzo Comunale of Siena, and we are at the very beginning of the 15th century, 1407, 1414. This Aristotle, as I was saying, speaks Latin. Both the inscriptions which you can see on the screen are in Latin, and in one of them Aristotle is speaking in first person. But there's another interesting Aristotle not far from Siena, from Asciano, and this is the image which I suggested for the flyer of this talk. This is another representation of Aristotle. Aristotle surrounded by allegories of the virtues, and in this case Aristotle is speaking Italian. So we have this interesting tension coming up, particularly between the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th century, about which language is Aristotle speaking to the public. And it is within this evolving linguistic context, or contest, that the taming of the philosopher by the courtesan makes Aristotle, if I may stick to the metaphor, fall from his professorial chair. It is in this context that his legacy opens up to the cultural and social universe of the vernacular. And instructive of this linguistic shift is another image of Aristotle, the philosopher in Limbo, as we see him in Dante's Divine Comedy. When I raised my eyes a little higher, I saw the master of those who know, sitting among his philosophic kindred. This is from Inferno 4. Aristotle does not even need in Dante to be mentioned by name. His priority among the philosophers of antiquity is indisputable. Yet, as Dante himself knew all too well, in order to be appropriated by those beyond the academic circles, Aristotle needs to be taken out of limbo and made vernacular. Dante's own project of translation was only partly successful. I will go back to it in a second. But what is true is that Aristotle, in many different ways, did manage to reach out to the vernacular readers. Needless to say, not all the Aristotelian corpus triggered the same enthusiasm on the part of vernacular readers. The area of the Aristotelian tradition which was appropriated more immediately by vernacular readers was that of moral philosophy. Meteorology was also another area which had a significant success in the vernacular in Italy in particular, and of course the rhetoric. But there's no comparison in terms of numbers when we look at translations or adaptations of the ethics and adaptations of the other works. For sure, whatever belongs to logic, metaphysics, the sort of hardest core of Aristotelian philosophy, didn't really make it through the vernacular till much later. And the reason why the ethics was so appealing is because it was perceived as relevant to the preoccupations of these vernacular readers, which were, in a way, the upper classes, right? Of course, this is a situation where only a few people were really into reading whatever. And of course, even more narrow is the kind of, real audience for reading philosophy. But still, there's an opening there coming up. So both merchants and aristocrats in city-states and also at court realized that Aristotle's ethics could provide them with a moral framework suitable to their social and economic welfare. By looking at the vernacular reception of the ethics in particular, it is possible to really identify the proactive role of readers, which proved seminal and fundamental to the dissemination of Aristotle. And what I'm kind of arguing, and I hope I will be able to show this more precisely, is that within this process of appropriation, the importance of the translators is matched by the importance of the active or proactive readers, as I call them. In cities like Venice and Florence, the rigorous mouthpiece of scholastic logic and dialectics, so Aristotle's Dialecticus, makes room for Aristotle the lawmaker and Aristotle the conversationalist. Here you see Aristotle in two capitals from the Palazzo Ducale in Venice. The first one is from 1350, about 1350, with a Latin inscription, Aristotle's Dialecticus. So Aristotle as the sort of embodiment of logic and dialectics. And of course, the inscription is in Latin. The second one, instead, well, I'm afraid you can't really read the inscriptions, but they are there. The second has an inscription in Italian. We are from the sort of in the 1450s here, and the inscription says Aristotele che die legge, so Aristotle who gave the laws. So we have this linguistic transition of some importance. The third image, a very famous one, brings us to Florence. It comes from the Campanile by Giotto, and it was interpreted in the Renaissance as depicting a dialogue between Aristotle and Plato. Now, we are not sure about the real iconographic program behind this particular tile, but what is interesting, to me at least, is that the earliest commentators on this image, Giorgio Vasari, for instance, in the 16th century, would describe it as, conversation between the two most important philosophers of antiquity. So the kind of, I would say, sort of retroactively applying to Aristotle something which was more in the sort of attitude of Plato, if you will, this idea of dialogue and conversation. Of course, the vernacular appropriation of Aristotle includes many sorts of hybridization. And the master of those who know goes through a process of diffraction, particularly when we get to understand and to study abridgments and adaptations. Aristotle is made speak to fellow philosophers, both ancient and modern, pagan and Christian. This is a beautiful illumination from a treatise on ethics by Luca Mannelli. It's a medieval treatise, a compendium of the ethics, which was translated into Italian very soon. And in this case, the ethics of Aristotle is reread through many other philosophers and made sort of match the other philosophical agendas, both of antiquity and of the Christian context. Of course, the idea that in these various circumstances the philosopher might speak the language of the people should not be read in terms of democratization. Rather, it should be read as part of a multifaceted linguistic universe in which translation facilitates the interaction between Latinate knowledge and that very small fraction of vernacular society which had the means, intellectual and material, to engage such conversations. But who were these people? Who were the readers so eager to learn about Aristotle's ethics? The novella from the Novellino, which I began with, tells us that the philosopher translator was translating for some lords and other persons. This laconic phrasing seems to allude to powerful men, lords, which might mean aristocrats and rulers, those who, according to Dante, were partly responsible for the very critical status of literature and literacy in his own time. So, between the end of the 13th century and the early 14th century. Defining the intended audience of his main philosophical work, the Convivio, Dante describes them in these terms. These noble persons comprise princes, barons, knights, and many other noble people, not only men but women, of which there are many who know only the vernacular and are not learned. Well, of course, learned means, who don't have Latin, right? Now, Dante is addressing these people, this category of people, because to his mind, they are the ones who should commit to the regeneration of society based on both political awareness and ethical principles. And of course, language plays an important role within this idea of regeneration. Yet, these are the same people who have left literature to those other who have changed it from a lady into a whore. Dante is harshly criticizing here those learned intellectuals university professors, intellectuals, more broadly scholars, who instead of caring about the dissemination of knowledge, have turned learning into a business. They prefer to keep it separate from the rest of society and discourage the use of the vernacular as a language for knowledge. The question then is how to reverse this situation. And Dante's answer, as usual, complicates things a bit. In fact, while Dante's perspective is the opposite of the one evoked by the Novellino, which associated the idea of debasement and prostitution with the vernacular, his commitment to bringing science and philosophy to vernacular readers does not come without some skepticism. So it's not a stark contrast here. So Dante himself has, some troubles with the idea of bringing this knowledge to the vernacular readers. The problem is that he believes that this particular mission should be pursued. Now, his skepticism, interestingly enough, is really about the most common way to bring philosophy to the vernacular readers, which is translation, right? He's skeptical about it. And if we wanted to stick to the lexicon of the time, we might want to talk about vulgarizamento rather than translation to court. So if the Novellino played with the idea that vulgarization is bad, in that it diminishes the status of learning, Dante argues that vulgarization is bad when it is not accompanied by careful work on the target language. As an outspoken champion of the mother tongue, in the Convivio, Dante explains that he did not write in Latin because he worried about the quality of potential translation of his Latin writing into the vernacular. And this is where he comes up with one example of the utmost interest. So basically he says, fearing that the vernacular might have been, so my vernacular, might have, the vernacular of the translator might have been set down by someone who would have made it seem offensive, as did the one who translated the Ethics from Latin, and that was Thaddeus the Hippocratist. I arranged to set it down, trusting in myself more than in another. So I didn't write in Latin, because I was worried that if I wrote in Latin, someone else would translate me into the vernacular, and I was worried that they would do it in a bad way. This is Dante 101, right, in terms of his aptitude to what others are able to do or not. So Dante here is referencing a text widely known in medieval Italy as l'Etica di Aristotele, Aristotle's Ethics, which in fact was not an Italian translation of Aristotle's Ethics from the Latin version of Robert Grosseteste, but the Italian translation of an Arabic compendium of the Ethics, the so-called Summa Alexandrinorum, translated into Latin by Hermannus Alemannus around 1240, and eventually turned into Italian around 1245, so very early, by Taddeo Alderotti, who was a Florentine professor of medicine based at the University of Bologna. And I will say something more about this text shortly. So quite clearly, Dante was not a big fan of Taddeo's vernacular, which looked to him not refined enough to truly do a good service to vernacular readers. So he does not provide sort of a clear explanation to support his criticism, but Dante is definitely raising here a problem that applied to translation more broadly, not only to the vernacular rendering of Latin texts, but to translation as kind of a practice, even within, so to speak, the same linguistic context. And the problem is that of bad translations. A few decades after Dante, Petrarch would address this very issue with reference to the Latin translations of Aristotle. So we are kind of connecting here Dante and Petrarch through this reflection on the translation of Aristotle. Dante talks about translating from Latin into Italian, and Petrarch is talking about translating from the original into Latin. In the invective on his ignorance and that of many others, Petrarch confesses to find Aristotle's style as it comes down to us less than pleasing. I admit that I take no great pleasure in the style of the famous man, Aristotle, as it comes down to us. crucial to his argument is the awareness that what he's reading is not Aristotle, but the result of unskilled translators. Because of the coarseness or the envy of his translators, the text of Aristotle has come down to us so harsh and rough that it scarcely charms the ear or sticks in the memory. The bottom line is that, given the nature of the Aristotelian texts available, so these bad translations, it is often easier for the speaker and more pleasant for the listener to express Aristotle's thought in words different from his own. But aren't words different from one's own the very matter of translation? Interestingly enough, through Dante and Petrarch, the problem of translation comes to the fore as a problem of both subject matter and style. Both authors insist on the idea that translation is not simply about turning a text from one language into another, but first and foremost, and this is really something which I think is particularly important to stress, about enhancing the target language so that it may become a fruitful tool for, in this case, philosophical inquiry. So the attention kind of shifts from the idea of bringing a text from one language to another and more on the idea of using translation and the other sort of means of adapting a text to enhance the target language, so that those readers, vernacular in this case, will be able to really have a tool for dealing with philosophical inquiry. Accordingly, Petrarch is also very critical towards the overabundance of commentaries. And scholars who work on medieval textuality we all know very well that commentaries are everywhere, right? And so Petrarch is quite dismissive about that genre. Instead of writing anything of their own, there are too many scholars, authors, philosophers, soi-disant, who turn to expounding the works of others. And by doing so, they devastate such works. So, Petrarch is kind of saying, okay, there are people who, instead of doing philosophy on their own, they just comment upon what others have written. And of course, he sees this as a practice which doesn't really go anywhere. The target of Petrarch's criticism here is the same one which Dante targeted in the Convivio. Scholars, most of whom in Petrarch's own time would hide behind the auctoritas of Aristotle to cope with their intellectual mediocrity. I mean, this is not my saying, this is sort of my summary of what Petrarch says. And this is actually the main claim of the treatise on his own ignorance and that of many others. So the picture that we can draw from the discussion of audience readership and translation in Dante and Petrarch is two-pronged. On the one hand, they identify a problem within the scholarly context. On the other hand, they call for the active engagement with learning and philosophical inquiry on the part of those social classes that, through learning and philosophical inquiry, may make a positive impact on society. Translation, to be understood in its broadest sense here, is the space where these two groups of people, in a way, can get to interact. Scholars, the Latinate people, and these vernacular readers. And this is also the space, that of translation, where they can negotiate their agendas. This interaction did happen, though not necessarily in the way in which Dante would have auspicated. A very instructive example of the linguistic and cultural tensions that I have described so far, and the one which I would like to briefly discuss in the final part of my talk, is the vernacular reception of Aristotle's Ethics, which offered translators and their readers many opportunities for interaction. And let me sketch the ways in which the ethics circulated in the later Middle Ages and in the early Renaissance. Needless to say, when I speak about the ethics in this context, the Greek text is basically out of the picture, right? The main version of the ethics which was available in the Middle Ages, and I'm simplifying a bit, but just for the sake of clarity, was the Latin translation of the Greek text by Grosseteste, as revised by William of Murdochey. I mean, there are other versions. Yeah, as you may know, there's a complex the study of the Aristotles Latinos. I shouldn't be saying this, of course, within these walls where these kind of things are very well known, but it's a very complex matter when we get to studying the sources. So I'm kind of just, recalling here that the main thread in the tradition of the ethics is really the gross test Mørbeke version. Now, this is the version which would basically remain steadily present in the university curriculum even after the appearance of a new wave of humanist translations in the 15th century, and most notably that by Leonardo Bruni, which spurred the famous polemic with Alfonso de Cartagena, which was this scholastic author, a commentator who was very much in favor of the old medieval translation of the Ethics and didn't really like that by Leonardo Bruni. There are other translations in Latin based on the Greek after Bruni. I'm not considering them here simply because they didn't really have an immediate impact on the vernacular context. And the reason why there is a dotted line connecting gross test, Mørbeke, and Bruni is because scholars have really demonstrated that even if Bruni's translation is indeed based on the Greek, he was also using, to some extent, gross test. At least he had the competing translation on his desk. The two earliest Italian translations of the Ethics were indeed based on these two Latin versions. So we have a very interesting case study here. The first one was by the Augustinian theologian Antonio Colombella from Recanati. This is a figure about whom I hadn't really heard anything before getting into this project. He's not a main author, but he did accomplish this important, remarkable project, the first Italian translation of the Ethics. And this translation was done at the behest of a Venetian merchant and aristocrat called Pancrazio Giustiniani. A few years later, in Florence, Bernardo Nuti, who was a renowned teacher of Latin and a member of the circle around Marsilio Ficino, so very entrenched in the humanist context of mid-15th century Florence, translated Bruni's humanist version of the Ethics into Italian. So these two projects could not be more different in their inspiration. One, Colombella's, follows in the footsteps of the Latin academic tradition, by which I mean, of course, the sort of medieval Latin academic tradition. The other translation, the one by Nuti, attempts to apply the new linguistic ideas of humanist culture to the vernacular. Colombella's survives in only one copy. Nuti's was more successful and was copied several times in Florence in the second half of the 15th century. However, and this is where, the other thing which I wanted to point out, is that as you can tell from the two manuscripts, these projects were really different, even in the way in which they were conceived. Now, you can't really see the details from there, but these are two, manuscripts which could be used in a class about the differences between late medieval manuscript making and the sort of humanist textual culture, in terms of handwriting, in terms of the way in which the text is presented, and of course, when we get to the details of the language, the two texts are really different. They're really different. However, as I was saying, there is another element in the story which makes things a little more complicated. So vernacular readers interested in reading about the Ethics could count, since the mid-13th century, on the very compendium of the Ethics mentioned by Dante in the Convivio, which I mentioned earlier. So this was not, as I said, a translation of the Ethics, but a translation of the Summa Alexandrinorum, this anonymous Arabic compendium of the Ethics translated into Latin by Hermannus Alemannus. The Latin version was soon translated into Italian by this professor whom I mentioned earlier, Taddeo Alderotti, and this is where the problems, textually speaking, begin. This text was also incorporated into the Tresor by Brunetto Latini, which is a very important encyclopedia that enjoyed significant success across Europe and which included a section, the second part of the book, which is presented as Aristotle's Ethics, which in fact is not the Ethics, but is yet another translation in French in this case, because the Trésor was written in French, while Brunetto Latini, who was Italian, was staying in France during political exile. So you see that the linguistic geography here gets also complicated. But this particular text, the Trésor, was translated very soon into Italian. It's known as Tesoro Volgare. And what happens here is also fascinating, because basically whoever translated the Trésor into Italian, when they got to the ethics section of the Trésor, they basically thought, well, you know, this comes from the Italian Etica by Taddeo. Let's just get back to it, right? So this of course complicates the textual tradition of these materials a lot, with many ways of sort of contaminations. Another aspect which is important to remind here is that after the Italian translation of the Trésor, the ethics portion of it in Italian was extracted and began to circulate on its own, right? So we have Taddeo's version circulating as the late 13th century. And then we have the French version of the Trésor, the Italian version of the Trésor, and yet another version of the Ethics extracted from the Trésor, from the Italian version of it. And on top of these, there were other Italian translations of the Summa Alexandrinorum, independent from the Taddeo Alderotti lineage. One by Niccolò Anglico, 4 copies exist of this translation, and an anonymous translation of which only 1 copy exists. The first reason why I'm sketching this picture is that this particular text, the abridgment, differently from the full translation of the Ethics, was a true bestseller. It actually got to be read till the mid-16th century. It was printed, and of course that made it even more widely available. The second reason is that, in my opinion, it would be really misleading to imagine these various textual transmissions as if they were separate, because we have textual manuscript evidence that at some point the translation of the Ethics and the translations of the Summa did interact. So I think it's important to bear in mind that when we talk about the ethics in Italy between the age of Dante and the 15th century, what we really talk about is the sort of coexistence of these two textual traditions. In spite of Dante's criticism, Taddeo's translation of the Summa Alexandrinorum did meet the needs of vernacular readers quite well. And why is that? For one thing, the Summa is shorter than the Ethics, and it spares its readers the philosophical sophistications that only trained philosophers would be able to unpack. Another point which I thought important to make is that a text like the Ethics, even if translated into one's own language, remains quite challenging a reading. And of course, the Summa did provide readers with something more manageable and easier to go through. And the manuscript circulation of the Summa in Italian, which counts a number of copies of various kinds, demonstrates that there was a burgeoning market for this kind of work. And it also shows that through this particular work, the world of Latinate learning was gradually made speak to the world of vernacular readership. And both Florence and Venice offer in this respect abundant evidence. Several copies of the Italian Summa bear interesting notes of possession, which tell us about a specific interest in this work on the part of citizens who were involved with the administration of the cities, members of the aristocratic families, and rich merchants. I found it striking, if illuminating, to find out, for instance, that even if only 1 copy exists of Antonio Colombella's translation of the Ethics, so the one on the left side of the slide, we do have evidence that at some point the text was kind of repackaged in combination with the Summa. And so this is just one example of several which I found of this constant going back and forth between the two texts. But by way of conclusion, let me pause on one specific example which tells us in a very striking way about the long-lasting impact of this, if you will, exquisitely medieval work, the Summa in Italian, which continued to be read in the context of humanism and which in fact intermingled with it in productive ways. And the example comes from the scribal activity of a Florentine aristocrat, Bonaccorso di Filippo Adimari. We are here in the mid-15th century, a member of Florentine aristocratic family, heavily involved with art patronage. And what is interesting about Bonaccorso is that he did copy several translations of Latin works for his own use and for the family and for his friends. He copied Cicero, he copied works by Sallust, by Livy, and he had a copy made by, which he made of the Summa in the translation by Taddeo Alderotti. This copy was made in 1445 for the use and ownership of himself and his friends. And the statement, of course, is a topos itself, commonly used to refer to forms of shared consumption of books. What makes Bonaccorso's case particularly relevant, though, is the fact that almost 20 years after copying the compendium of the Ethics, he also copied the vernacular translation of Leonardo Bruni's Latin version of the Ethics, prepared in the 1460s by Bernardo Nuti. So we have someone who in the 1440s gets a copy for his own reading of the Summa Alexandrinorum in Italian, and then in the 1460s he makes a copy of the actual Ethics, if you will. Adimari's copy of Nuti's translation of the Ethics was meant to be read by friends and family members as well. This book was written by Bonaccorso di Filippo Adimari of Florence for his own perusal and that of his friends and acquaintances, as someone who takes much pleasure in this sort of thing. It was begun and completed in December 1464. Leonardo of Arezzo's moral canzone, Leonardo of Arezzo is Leonardo Bruni, follows. It defines what is happiness and of what it consists. Deo gratias, amen. As far as the manuscript itself indicates, Bonaccorso's desire for his children to read the book and keep it in the family was fulfilled. A later note of possession, added by a younger member of the family, Bernardo di Paolino, informs us that the Ethics was given to him by Bonaccorso, who wrote it in this house and who pushed him, that is Bernardo, to study the text carefully and acquire virtue in youth. So to make this learning experience easier, Bonaccorso introduced a set of paratextual elements. In particular, he added rubrics at the beginning of each book of the Ethics and then copied all of them in a sort of table of contents, which would, sort of help the reader to get an immediate sense of what the Ethics is about. And he also included a poem, a song at the end of the treatise, Leonardo Bruni's own Canzone Morale, which is meant to summarize the key topics discussed in the Ethics. I would say this is if the Summa Alexandrinorum is an abridgment of the Ethics, the Canzone Morale by Leonardo Bruni is the abridgment of the abridgment, so to speak. It's a very short text, covering just the basics, really, some of the basic ideas of what we find in the Ethics. This particular copy of the Ethics by Bonaccorso di Filippo Adimari illustrates the active role of the scribe in repackaging the text in line with the reading habits of its new lay audience outside the context of Latinate scholarship. So Bernardo Nuti had brought Bruni's version of the Ethics to the vernacular by sort of translating it into Latin. And what I'm arguing is that Adimari took part in this translation process as well by further reducing the distance between the original humanist project, that of Bruni, and contemporaneous vernacular readership, who had already been familiarizing with this kind of materials through the Summa Alexandrinorum before. And by recommending that his children read the Ethics Boccaccio is also displaying an attitude towards moral education that differs significantly from that of Aristotle, or at least from Aristotle's instructions as they were received. Aristotle did not consider the reading of the ethics or the study of moral philosophy suitable for the young, but of course, he recommended it as a discipline to be acquired later in age. Now, moral education for youths in the Middle Ages was traditionally conveyed through the study of grammar. And of course, I'm thinking here about the magnificent work on this topic by Paul Gale. This form of education, based on the merger of the classics with Christian doctrine, intended to provide young adults with the basics of moral philosophy, that is, with prescriptive norms, rather than with skills for active inquiry or for active speculation, philosophical speculation. So, while Aristotle's writings were indeed studied in universities and religious schools, they also made their way through the popular forms of moral education thanks to various kinds of translation, adaptation, and repackaging, as I said, including both compendia and anthologies. Another chapter of the story, which I won't be able to discuss today, but which is really fascinating, is that of notebooks, especially by merchants. In the 15th century, several Florentine merchants and elsewhere were taking notes about their own readings, and they were copying bits and pieces of their readings into these zibaldoni, as they are called. And those are another gold mine in terms of reading and in terms of understanding what people read at the time. So once the complexity of Aristotle's philosophy was tamed by popularization, the philosopher could be easily considered an author for young readers as well. This editorial translation tended to reduce philosophical inquiry to issues of moral conduct, which of course is a huge difference, right? A similar mindset characterizes the didactic function assigned to Aristotle in the Adimari household, both when we get to talk about the Summa and when we get to talk about the ethics. Yet one could argue that the shift from the compendium to the full ethics marks an upgrade within the household of the Adimari. From 1445, when they were reading the Summa, they get reading the actual ethics in the 1460s. So there's another way here to bridge across Latinate knowledge and vernacular readership. Now, to conclude, examples of this kind, I have many more in the book, uncover the flexibility and instability of vernacular translation, a space that allowed for various kinds of interaction between translators and readers. Both translators and readers took part in a process of reception that challenges common assumptions about linear development and decline of cultural trends. So, we tend to think in terms of humanism versus scholasticism, innovation versus tradition, and even in terms of Latin versus the vernacular. But actually, all these things were sort of cohabiting, and they did so in the vernacular context as well. Even if the taming of Aristotle entailed forms of simplification, vernacular translation was nonetheless fueled by a dialogic exchange between translators and readers. Translators were responsible for translating the sources, but readers became translators in their own right by bringing those very sources out to their peers, keeping the conversation alive, and in a way making Aristotle their own. Thank you.
We have time for about 15 minutes of questions.
Sure.
Thank you. This is a very fascinating talk on a subject I'm very interested in. I was thinking as you were talking about Rita Copeland's book about translation, and that work would make one expect that in these vernacular versions, whether of the Liber Alexandrinorum or directly of the Ethics, that the translators would have been engaging with commentators, the people that were being criticized here, and incorporating material from the commentaries into their vernacular translations to make them more accessible. Do you have evidence of that kind of thing going on?
Well, thank you for an excellent question. Well, first, I would like to acknowledge the fact that one of the sort of inspirations for this very project is undoubtedly Rita Copeland's book, which I remember reading that book and sort of really getting a sense of what I wanted to work on. So, I wish to acknowledge, and also the many conversations I've had with her over the years. And actually, one of the sort of topics which we have been discussing even with Rita Copeland is that of really how to combine these two different ways of readings, right? So on the one hand, translating, and on the other hand, incorporating materials from other sets of works. Now, in the cases which I've been working on, interestingly enough, commentaries do not show up that frequently. What is much more evident, though, is the idea really of sort of dismembering the sources and repackaging them in all sorts of ways. Now, I haven't presented the most creative ways to do that, but there are some interesting cases where that happens. I did find some evidence of looking into commentaries on a couple of occasions where translators would add, sort of short glosses, kind of to expound a specific term, or at times on the margins of a manuscript. But that's not so frequent. What I did find, and this is also fascinating, and I think it makes an interesting difference when we think about the paradigm sort of outlined by Copeland's book, is that some of these vernacular readers did request clean copies of the sources without commentaries. They were very sort of explicit about it. So what is clear is that many of them, even if not all of them, really cared for the text. Now, they didn't care for the text to be philologically reconstructed, so I think they wouldn't mind if the text was filled with other bits and pieces. But what they didn't really care for was the idea of, the regular commentary, which we are familiar with when we think about particularly the commentaries on Aristotle, which are such a widely circulating kind of genre. So I think there's also possibly a comment to be made in terms of the geography of these readers and also the chronology. What I noticed, at least within the Italian tradition, is that readers, these vernacular readers, even if they weren't philosophers or scholars, they got interested into the subtleties of philosophical inquiry later. The 15th century is really the moment when that happens, and not necessarily because of a humanist approach. That's another point which I wanted to kind of make. This idea that vernacular readers want to know more and want to get some basic skills at that point to do philosophy on their own doesn't come only from the humanist context, but also from the more traditional and let's say medieval way of thinking about knowledge. And translation offers this kind of very grayish area where these encounters are made possible.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Refini. Very interesting. I had a quick question about the link that you make between Dante and Petrarch, specifically when Petrarch is complaining about the way in which the text of Aristotle is supposedly being corrupted through Latinate reception. And I was wondering whether in that comment Petrarch is not only referring to perhaps his contemporaries, but also to the, I guess there was this notion that people were quoting Cicero when he said, Aristotle, his dialogues were so much better than those of Plato, and so the expectation was that in reality his writing would be some amazing thing, and then when they actually go and check the reading, it's not so much like that. So I was wondering whether you think Petrarch also had perhaps that whole issue in mind. And my second question was more about, I know that more or less in the period you're talking about, since we were talking about commentators and commentaries, and Dante makes the famous, when he meets Averroes in Inferno, said il gran commento feo, he praises this commentator. So I was wondering whether Petrarch, in his criticism of the commentators, was also like, I don't know, does he include Thomas Aquinas and Averroes and those famous commentators in his criticism, or is it maybe more limited to the scholars of his day, who like maybe lesser scholars who really all they do, all their output consists in commentaries?
Right. Well, thank you very much. Let me begin with the last question. He doesn't say, right? So Petrarch, you know, as you all know, is very also ironic in his writing, particularly in that invective. What is clear is that, well, certainly, and this is also a way to answering the previous question, he does know that sort of commonplace about the supposedly beautiful, eloquent style of Aristotle in the original, right? Which he finds in all sorts of classical sources, Cicero in primis, but also others. So he kind of comes from that sort of idea that according to Cicero and the others, Aristotle was a very eloquent writer in Greek. And what we read in the Latin translations, oh my gosh, is nothing eloquent, right? It's just awful Latin. Of course, they weren't aware of the complexities of the Aristotelian textual tradition, because of course, you know, with all due respect, when you read the Ethics today, it's a fascinating work, but it's certainly not remarkable in its sort of eloquence, right? So the complexity of the various textualities of Aristotle's Greek weren't known by people like Petrarch. So the bias there is based on these traditional commonplace which you were remembering. At the very same time, Petrarch is very specific in targeting the quality of the translators. So, you know, even if that idea of Aristotle's eloquence is not sort of grounded in reality, Petrarch's point about the translation holds, because really he found that, you know, if you compare the style of Cicero to that of the Latin Aristotle, well, there's no way to come up with a positive evaluation there. But of course, as usual with Petrarch, the linguistic argument has a very important moral implication, because the other argument which he builds based on the previous one is that scholars who are not interested in eloquence, like the scholars of the university of his own time, you know, are probably not interested in real virtue either, right? The idea is that a good management of language is conducive to behaving virtuously. So Petrarch says, I'm not very interested in knowing about virtue. That's fine, but I'm more interested in being virtuous. And you do that through action, through active life. But you do that through language as well. And that's where, in a way, he kind of sort of brings the two aspects together. And certainly he is more critical than Dante towards the tradition of the commentaries. He doesn't mention Thomas Aquinas. I'm sure that, you know, we all know that Petrarch was very learned. He was very familiar with most of those works. I think the primary reference, though, really goes to the scholars of his own time. The invective on his own ignorance is really targeting 4 people who were acquaintances of him, based in Venice, in the Veneto, who were dealing with Aristotelian stuff in a very precise kind of way. So the controversy there is very based on a sort of mid 14th century situation, where you have someone like Petrarch who advocates for the beauty of language versus the others, these sort of Aristotelian scholars who, you know, sort of hide behind the auctoritas of Aristotle, but who in fact are bad scholars and also bad translators, and they don't really handle language as they should. So all these threads get together, I think, in his invective.
I wanted to follow up on something that we said earlier. So the question of accessibility in translation, could you say more about the relationship of the song to the prose versions, and how you see that functioning?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you for asking that. Let me try to be brief about it. So we do know that a song like the one by Leonardo Bruni, La Canzone Morale, you know, sort of is a philosophical song in that it addresses philosophical content. the bottom line is that he sort of reviews the various philosophical legacies, and in the end he kind of seems to sort of advocate for the privilege of the Aristotelian tradition. And of course it's all about sort of seeking what is good and being virtuous. So it's a very basic interpretation of what moral philosophy is, even within the Aristotelian tradition. The ethics, of course, is full of many other things, which the Canzone Morale doesn't really tackle at all. So the Canzone Morale is something which anyone coming from that household would have read easily, right? I have still doubts about the actual reading and time spent with the text of the Ethics, which, as I said, remains a rather difficult reading. What I find interesting here, and the reason why I focus on this example, is that by adding the Canzone Morale at the end of the Ethics as a summary, Bonaccorso is doing the same thing which others were doing within the vernacular tradition with other genres. And not only in the 15th century, but even before. Both in lay literature and in spiritual or religious literature. The most important case in Italy would be that of Domenico Cavalca, who was a preacher, a Dominican preacher, and he was very famous for writing a series of moral, religious, spiritual treatises, which most often included poetical pieces as summaries. So the idea of combining prose and verse comes from that. And there's also another important model for Bonaccorso and for all people at the time, which is that of the model of the prosimetro, the prosimeter. Of course, we could go back to Boethius, but for all these people in 14th and 15th century Italy, at least the ones who were learned enough to read things, Dante's own Convivio would come up as a good example. So Dante does the same in a way, because he had in the Convivio songs and prose explanation of those songs. So it's kind of, it's inverted, but the result in terms of what the book is about is similar. You have a text, and then you have the idea of providing a poetical version of it. In this case, in the case of the Canzone Morale, very abridged, super abridged. But I think the gesture there should be read as a way to really make this kind of work a little more similar to what other works would be looking like.
So like a genre imitation.
Yes, that's certainly part of the story. And of course, the other point is the prestige of Leonardo Bruni, who, of course, in Florence in the 15th century was one of the most important authors you might want to mention, right? And of course, it's just super fitting that he was both the original translator of the Latin version and the author of a vernacular Canzone Morale. Bruni himself is another liminal figure in this story, because he's someone who works mainly with Latin, but he did write things in the vernacular as well. So the kind of reflection here would apply to Bruni in the first place.
We have a question from someone viewing the talk through the stream. I believe Dr. Therese Corey, thanks you for an excellent talk. And they ask if there's any evidence that vernacular translations of Aristotle or other philosophical texts might have been influenced or read in university contexts. They ask, for instance, if a scholar were to say, Aristotle says, and if that subsequent quote might be a vernacular translation as a possible source in this particular period of transition.
Well, this is a fantastic question. Thanks to the person who raised it. Well, the easiest answer would be to sort of redirect for this particular question to the works of David Lyons, whose work on the sort of teaching of the ethics in universities in the Italian Renaissance has been extremely important, and he goes through a series of examples. As far as I could see in the case studies I did manage to gather, we do have evidence not of using the vernacular in the university classroom, but we do have evidence of vernacular versions of these works being circulating within the university context. On some occasions, for instance, the translators who translate from Latin into Italian are labeled and defined in the rubrics as scolari or as maestri. So there's a lexicon which really comes from the context of university learning. And even the shape of some of these manuscripts, and this applies to the Summa Alexandrinorum as well, do gesture towards the typical university textbook. Now, it's a very broad textual transmission with all sorts of examples, and we do have books of that kind, but we also have books which are clearly meant to be circulating within private households, mainly of mercantile extraction. So it's not a sort of absolute answer here, but just to say that the manuscript evidence tells us that there is an ongoing conversation, even sort of in material terms, between the people who were responsible for translating and their audience. On the actual use of the vernacular in the classroom, that's really hard to say. We do have evidence slightly later of discussions about the opportunity of using the vernacular even at the university. There's a very famous dialogue by Speroni, who's a mid-16th century Italian philosopher, entitled Dialogo delle Lingue, in which he sort of brings up two interlocutors. One of them is Pietro Pomponazzi, the great professor of the Aristotelian tradition, professor of Padua, and the other guy is a humanist, a Greek humanist, Ianos Laskaris. And what is interesting there is that the humanist basically says, well, we should be reading Aristotle in Greek. And the other guy, Pomponazzi, whose works, as far as we know, were all in Latin, but we do know that he was also sort of merging languages and mixing languages in his own teaching. He basically says, as a character in the dialogue, let's, move to doing philosophy in the vernacular. Let's translate everything into the vernacular, because reading in Latin and Greek is just a waste of time. Once we get ready to really deal with those languages, it's too late for our brains to be working, in a philosophical way. So the idea is that we spend years learning those languages and we don't do philosophy. So it's too late to be doing philosophy once we get those languages, right? Of course, this is not Pomponazzi's real voice, but it is interesting that in the 1540s, this particular problem gets raised in such a vocal and outspoken way.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, can you please join me all in thanking our speaker today? And please do all stay around. There's a reception right through there into the Byzantine Studies room. And those of you who are at home and are nearby, you can feel free to drop by if you want. We'll have plenty of food for everybody. Thank you all for coming, and dig in, I guess, is the right thing to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much.